If, in 2014, you were a horror fan with an extra $80 million, you could have gotten yourself one hell of an impressive collectible. As, at that time, multiple news outlets reported this was the asking price to purchase Bran Castle, a national monument and landmark in the Transylvania region of Romania. Bran Castle is one of the region's most popular tourist destinations, though not necessarily for its actual history. Built between the years of 1211 and 1388, the castle was initially meant for use as a military fortress, and housed both Teutonic knights and Romanian royalty throughout the centuries, before, in the 1920s, being given as a gift to members of the Habsburg royal family. But while that all might be interesting, most of its visitors today probably come because of what the heirs to the Habsburg royal family eventually turned it into, a museum and tourist attraction commonly known as Dracula's Castle. Of course, there's a catch. For while the over 500,000 visitors it receives a year can walk through its 57 rooms, winding hallways, and secret passages to view numerous pieces of medieval weaponry and armor, not to mention several torture devices, there is in fact no record to suggest that the real Vlad Dracula ever lived in the castle. Quite the opposite, as some official records only suggest he may have been imprisoned there for a short time. And while it might match at least some of the physical descriptions of the castle inhabited by the titular vampire in Bram Stoker's classic 1897 novel, Dracula, there's nothing to suggest that Stoker himself ever actually visited the location either, most likely simply basing the castle in his novel on descriptions he read of Bran Castle while doing research on Transylvania. Still, that hasn't stopped its owners and the Romanian government from playing up its connection to both Stoker's vampire and the real-life Dracula. And perhaps this level of artifice is somewhat appropriate, given the connections between Stoker's novel and the historical Dracula have themselves been greatly exaggerated over the years. For while Stoker certainly took the name of his character from the historical Vlad Tepes, also known as Vlad Dracula, this is where the connection ends. Perhaps Stoker thought the name was appropriate for his fictional bloodsucker, given the historical accounts concerning Vlad Dracula, a 1400s prince known for particularly brutal methods of dispatching and punishing his enemies, including beheading, boiling and skinning alive, and, of course, impaling them on large stakes outside his actual castle, the move that earned him his famous moniker, Vlad the Impaler. But Stoker decided on the name well into drafting his book, and it's unlikely he ever intended to suggest any actual connection between his vampire account and the real-life figure. Yet, over the years, a number of adaptations across various media have run with the idea of the historical Vlad Dracula, in fact inspiring or simply becoming the undead villain, which is good news for the owners of Bran Castle, as it's probably much easier to sell tourists on visiting the supposed home of the alleged inspiration for one of pop culture's most famous horror icons, than it is to entice tourists to visit an actually unrelated castle that might have just served as some slight inspiration for tiny elements of Stoker's novel. Then again, maybe the truth is well known enough that it's played a part in the difficulty its owners have had in actually selling the property, as, despite its undeniable success as a tourist attraction, including cleverly being used as a COVID-19 vaccine site in 2020, the property's asking price has consistently been lowered over time, allegedly once being on the market for $135 million, then hitting the aforementioned $80 million in 2014, before again being publicized as on sale for just $66 million in 2016. Of course, the lack of indoor plumbing might not be helping either. Whatever the case, whether Bran Castle remains in the hands of its current owners, or is purchased by some entrepreneurial spirit looking to expand its already undeniable tourism potential, Dracula's Castle and the surrounding Transylvania region will most likely continue to attract visitors, many of them horror fans eager to feel as if they're stepping into the world of the genre's greatest villain. And it's just as likely the confusion regarding the fictional and real Dracula will continue as well, as authors and filmmakers alike will insist on giving Stoker's creation a backstory more directly tied to the real-life Vlad the Impaler. After all, the idea was too intriguing for even the studio that made Dracula a household name to resist, when it came time for them to once again resurrect and explain the character in a new prequel film. The year is 2014, and Universal Pictures is ready to launch a brand new franchise starring one of their most iconic monsters, with Dracula Untold. Welcome once again to Failure to Franchise, the show dedicated to some of Hollywood's most infamous mistakes, missteps, and misfires. This is Trev.
And I am Chris, here to finally tell you about the untold story of my friend and colleague, Dracula, in this here third entry of our spooktacular Curse of the Dark Universe.
Oh man, I hope I don't get canceled for that. Chris, I want to run something by you.
Go ahead.
I got three options here. You let me know which one's working here, right? Okay, I'm gonna go for it. Dracula Untold, more like Dracula Unsold, because it didn't sell enough tickets to get a sequel. Okay.
I've turned it off. The recording.
Hold on, I got two more. Two more.
Oh, we're not done yet. Okay.
No, we're not. All right. Dracula Untold, more like Day for Night Shooting Untold, because this movie is full of just a lot of very bright nighttime scenes.
That one's a little too inside baseball.
Okay. Well, maybe this third one, I think this is the home run here. Dracula Untold, more like, hey, Hollywood, stop trying to make Luke Evans happen. I know, that one's maybe a little sweaty. Maybe that one needs a couple more drafts. But
that's on the nose.
Yeah, okay. So as alluded to by both Chris's perhaps horrifyingly racist caricature and some of my rewrites of the title here, today we are looking at 2014's Dracula Untold, another entry in our Curse of the Dark Universe 2-month event. We're in October, baby, Halloween month, so looking at one of the most iconic horror villains of all time. Chris, why don't you tell us a little bit about Dracula Untold?
It is directed by Gary Shore, actually his first feature. Actually, this is a trio of first features. Let me just get this out of the way. The director and the writing duo. So again, directed by Gary Shore, written by Matt Sazama and Burke Sharpless. First of all, that's an unfortunate name. Sharpless, because look at his filmography. These guys might be a staple of our show, as this was their first movie, but then they go on to write Last Witch Hunter, Gods of Egypt, and Power Rangers, all three slated for our enjoyment in the future. Mm-hmm. Of course, Dracula, created by Bram Stoker. Mm-hmm. The budget of this film is $70 million. Domestically, it made $56 million. And worldwide, I was surprised by this, it made $217 million. So I don't want to say it was a hit, but it definitely made money. So, Trev, why are we discussing it?
Well, I think we'll get into that. But you're right. This is, sometimes we don't only look at box office bombs. I know I made the Dracula. I know I made the brilliant Dracula Unsold joke. But honestly, this did okay. Financially, this would be considered, I'd say, a minor hit. Or at least a profitable film. But of course, we will talk about how. Here we are. Here we are covering it on this show, and we're not talking about Dracula Told, which I assume is what the sequel would have been called, or whatever it might be. So we'll get into that. But because I think it is very important, because we decided to name this entire event Curse of the Dark Universe. The Dark Universe, of course, referring to this idea of Universal trying to kind of resurrect their Universal monsters into a shared universe to compete with the MCU, essentially, to kind of try to latch on to that framework that had been established. And significantly enough, we looked at Van Helsing, which kind of felt like what would have been like the Avengers or something, right? A culminating event, kind of this monster mash, so that they try to start off with right out of the gate. That doesn't work. We looked at Wolfman, which, had its own issues, kind of came out of the gate amidst a bunch of bad buzz and just kind of never recovered. But I think it's very significant that this is the first one. So this is 2014, right? This is the first Universal monster remake we are going to look at that comes in a post-Avengers world. That's really important. Mm-hmm. The Wolfman, of course, comes after, the MCU starts, but you think about how it was set up in 2006. That's when Benicio del Toro signs on. All that development, it took forever. We talked about the rocky road it had. So, it's actually kind of more indicative of a pre-MCU mentality still. Dracula Untold is very much a post-MCU attempt to get this going, and we'll see that in the film for sure, and I think we'll talk about that. Chris, would you kind of agree with that you can see like the imprint of the MCU all over this film?
Oh, absolutely. A lot of, we'll get to it later, maybe some team-up stuff is hinted at, superpowers, which we'll get to, even so much as hiring the guy who did the score for Iron Man 1. So there's definitely a template, and this one followed it, not to a T, or else we would not be talking about it.
Yeah. Well, and I think if you are going to, if you're Universal and you're deciding that, our version of the MCU, our attempt to compete with that shared universe, that cinematic universe, is our Universal Monsters franchise, who's going to be our Iron Man? Right? Who do we want to lead out of the gate with? Who's our most important? Who's our crucial figure? I suppose it makes sense to look at Dracula.
Yeah.
Dracula, of course, one of the most iconic, most famous literary characters, certainly one of, if the biggest, if not the biggest horror characters of all time. I think I might have mentioned this in a previous episode. I think I probably mentioned the Van Helsing episode, but it's often been said that probably no character has been played by more actors than Dracula. So, of course, we're talking about Dracula as, we're not talking about the historical Dracula, which we'll get into this episode, but we're talking about the Dracula who comes from Bram Stoker's 1897 novel of the same name. The Lord of the Vampires, as we would often think of him, this kind of very, very classic character, but been presented in so many different ways, so many different interpretations. We actually had a listener kind of request that, since I'm kind of a little bit more of the horror-attuned host of the two of us, they wanted me to talk about maybe just my thoughts on, and it'll actually be a great setup for this episode. What are my thoughts on the best interpretations of Dracula, or my personal favorite interpretations of Dracula? So, Chris, if you'll indulge me, I thought I might share that really briefly with my top 5 media interpretations of Dracula.
Yeah, let me go get a sandwich.
Okay, great. All right, now that Chris is gone, guys, here's the real deal with this podcast. This is actually, I started this as I'm not going to get into some crazy Illuminati thing or something, but no, I'll just talk about, okay, so let me just say something right off the bat, because this is going to be very controversial, and I want to address why I'm doing it. The elephant in the room here, I'm gonna leave Bela Lugosi off of my top 5. Oh my God, I know it's crazy not to have him in there, but let me explain why. Because I just think it's almost unfair to even include Bela Lugosi in the list. He's obviously the gold standard. I think almost every version of Dracula you see, or certainly the majority of them, are riffing on that classic Bela Lugosi performance for a reason. That, to me, when I think of Dracula, I do think of Bela Lugosi. So if I was just rating this on most important Dracula portrayals, or what is like the ultimate go-to Dracula portrayal, of course Bela Lugosi would be number 1. Mm-hmm. I just thought it might be more interesting to kind of take him out of that and say, okay, if putting that aside, right, what are my other 5 favorites? All right, so I'm just acknowledging that right now. If Lugosi was here, he'd clearly be very high on this list, but I'm just leaving him off so I can have a little bit more fun and say, what other Draculas have I enjoyed over time?
Right.
Okay. So my number 5 is actually, despite being a filthy Canadian, I want to give credit to this guy.
Okay. You're gonna mention it's me from my intro to this episode.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I had a completely different one, but I just crossed it off because I was so impressed. Chris instantly slats into my number 5. No, I'm talking about the actor, maybe an actor not a lot of people know, and if you do know him, it's most likely from this performance, and that is Duncan Regehr as Dracula in the awesome 80s kids horror movie Monster Squad. Chris, have you seen Monster Squad?
I have not seen Monster Squad, no.
Okay, this is one you should definitely check out.
Yeah, this is on my shame list.
Yeah, written by Shane Black, directed by Fred Decker. Really fun kind of monster movie version of the Goonies, essentially, with a team of, or a squad of young kids who are all obsessed with the Universal monsters and classic horror, who end up actually having to fight the monsters. And in that, the leader of the monsters is portrayed by Duncan Regehr as Dracula. Interestingly enough, that was actually almost Liam Neeson. Liam Neeson almost played Dracula in this. That didn't happen, so instead we got Duncan Regehr. And to me, this is very much a nostalgic favorite. I do think it's a great performance. I think he's a very kind of fun, classical, super villain version of Dracula, but also he really is one of the main ones I grew up with as a kid, because as a kid I watched Monster Squad all the time, and I actually found him to be quite terrifying. And I think there's even still, when you watch it today as an adult, there's a particular scene you'll see when you watch the movie, Chris, where this Dracula is actually threatening a very, very little girl, and it's actually really, really scary. And so he sticks with me as one of the better versions I've seen. I like
to think Liam Neeson in the role was like, whoever you are, I will find you. All right, sorry.
Let's see how many times we can get you to bust that out. My number 4 would be the most recent interpretation that's on this list, and it speaks to how kind of fun I found him, that he's already in my top 5 personal favorite Draculas, and that is Clay Spang, who played Dracula in the Netflix version. I thought he just did a really, really great job of, again, kind of giving us this traditional kind of classic version of Dracula, especially in the first 2 episodes, And then the third episode actually allowing it to play that Dracula fish out of water a little bit, kind of bringing up into the modern day. I found him to be very charming, very funny. This was a very, coming from Stephen Moffat, kind of a more kind of like a sarcastic Dracula, a lot of like kind of, jokes and one-liners. And I thought he just played that very, very well, but also still had that level of like of sexuality and menace. It's all there. So I just thought he's probably my favorite modern Dracula within the last few years. And when you say that, you can be like, well, is there really a lot? Yes, because there's like 10 different Draculas every year,
Is that a miniseries or what is it?
It's very much like Sherlock in that it's like one season, but each season it's just 3 90-minute episodes. Okay. So it's essentially like a Dracula movie trilogy. That's kind of a nice way to look at it. I really like it. I'll throw out a big recommendation to it. It seems to be the common perception of it is most people really like the first 2 episodes, and a lot of people hate the third. I will defend the third. I think it's the weakest of the 3, but I think it's okay. I think the only problem with the third is that what happens in the third should have been 2 episodes. So I think it should have been 4 altogether, not 3. So the third feels a little rushed. Okay. My number 3, Chris, I'm not sure you are too familiar with this one, but I think you definitely know this one at least. And that is Christopher Lee as Dracula. Of course, starring as Dracula in a series of Hammer films. And as he kind of went along, I think each time doing it with slightly less enthusiasm because he really was very worried about getting typecast as Dracula. And essentially, it's very well known that he really didn't want to keep coming back, but he kept coming back because he just felt a sense of like obligation. He really wanted to. He was, Christopher Lee is one of those classical Hollywood nice guys who I think they could always get him back by saying, if you don't make this, Chris, our everyone might lose their jobs, and the crew could really use it. So he keeps coming back, and to his credit, even though he's not into it, every time he plays Dracula, he's pretty damn awesome. This is Dracula as just like pure monster. I think there is Christopher Lee is a handsome man. There's a certain level of sexuality, but this is just more Dracula as pure predator. Right. And I really love his performance. I think he's arguably the scariest Dracula of them all. So I definitely always come back to him, and having played the character as many times as he did, he ultimately goes right up there. He's right next to Bela Lugosi as the 2 most kind of iconic ones, I think, in cinema in general. So I think he has to be mentioned. Yeah. My number 2 is actually not a movie or TV show. Instead, if I'm just talking about my favorite interpretations of the character, I'm actually going to take the Dracula from Marvel Comics, and in particular from Tomb of Dracula, the long-running Dracula comic book in the 70s from Marvel, where Marvel kind of just appropriated Dracula, which anyone can do as a public domain character. He also exists in the DC universe, but this is the Marvel version of him, and just threw him into the Marvel universe and said, let's just treat him as a supervillain, and let's play up like what would it be like if Dracula existed in the universe. Of course, this is the comic book where we are introduced to the character of Blade, who's brought into this comic as a vampire hunter, and ultimately an arch rival of Dracula. But again, I love Dracula as supervillain, and I think the Marvel version of him is just really, really effective. It's a very fun book. It's kind of everything you want from Dracula as just a pure bad guy. Again, just kind of have like an arch sinister plans, really well written, very, very fun.
So you must have loved when they interpreted him for a Blade Trinity, the Marvel movie.
Oh, that's my number 1. You gave it away.
Sorry.
No, just kidding. No, I'm on record as saying, unfortunately, that's one of the biggest bummers of Blade Trinity. There are many, but one of the biggest is that taking Marvel's version of Dracula, who's one of my favorite versions, and giving us Drake, which to me might be the worst on-screen Dracula I've ever seen. I know my number 1 is, Chris, I know one you just have some recent history with, and that is Gary Oldman as Dracula. Now here we have, to me, from, of course, Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, here we have what to me is just the perfect synthesis of everything we want from Dracula. Mm-hmm. The monster, the sex icon, the tragic figure, but the villain who you also hate. Gary Oldman is able to take all of that, wrap it all together. We have, even on a visual level, we have different iconic versions of him. Of course, we have the old man Dracula, who just looks so weird and kind of scary and otherworldly that was instantly iconic the moment you saw him come on screen the first time. And instantly parodied to no end. You saw that already, kind of everyone wanted to mock that. But that's because when something gets parodied that much, it struck a chord with pop culture, and it stuck with people. And then later in the film, you have, the young Gary Oldman, with, dressed to the nines, seducing Winona Ryder, and you kind of get it. You're like, yeah, that's a sexy guy. I totally buy into this relationship. And then you have some kind of permutations of that throughout. It takes different forms. I love this film. I'm a huge defender of this movie, because sometimes you'll meet people who are less thrilled about it. It has, it's definitely a popular movie. But I certainly, I've never met too many people who think Gary Oldman was a bad Dracula. I think
Totally.
it's pretty well established that he rules in this role. And to me, he's my personal favorite if, again, we're removing Lugosi out of the equation.
Yep. I was a little surprised that you didn't bring up Dracula from Van Helsing, but fair enough. I'll allow it this one time.
Not in the top 5. No,
yeah, maybe top 10.
Yeah. Anyways, Chris, why don't we talk about your history with the Dracula character? So I will just say flat out, I've mentioned before, I would just put Dracula forward as my favorite literary character, one of my favorite characters in general. How about you? What's your kind of past history with this character?
Well, Trev, let me take you along the anecdotal history of Chris and Daddy D, as I like to call him. Mm-hmm. I don't have too much of a history with Dracula as much as you do. We have about a 48-year difference on us, so I haven't seen as much as you have. But I'm
a contemporary of Bram Stoker, so I was able to see all these versions. Yeah.
You held the candle as he and the quill and the ink for him.
Yeah.
So for me, it all started with Dracula Dead and Loving It.
What an introduction.
So that's a 1995 film. I was a kid at the time, and my grandpa was really getting me into slapstick comedy films, so like the Mel Brooks stuff, and then a Canadian great, Leslie Nielsen. So this isn't one of his best ones. I know that, especially now as an adult. But that was my first introduction to Dracula, was that film.
So, Chris, can I ask, was there a split second where you thought I was going to say Leslie Nielsen as Dracula in that film?
No, I didn't. Maybe as a joke, but definitely not for real.
Oh, okay.
Well, flash forward to 2004, and about 5 to 6 rewatches later, I watched Van Helsing. So, your favorite. From there, the same year, I was working at the movie theater at this time, so the same year Blade Trinity came out, so I watched that. You may say in 2004, I was on sort of a Dracula kick at the time. Then flash forward to 2012, where I watched Hotel Transylvania. I don't really have an anecdote here. I think I just watched it on a whim on like VOD or whatever. Mm-hmm. Then in 2017, my buddy came to me and was like, we should do a movie challenge. So what this movie challenge is that you would pick one movie from the 10s, 2 from the 20s, 3 from the 30s, 4 for the 40s, and so on up until the 2010s. And I chose for my 1922 film, Nosferatu. So I decided to finally watch that. Obviously iconic, and I feel like I've seen that before, just like in film studies classes and blah blah blah. But it was nice for me to finally sit down and watch it. Then move to this past weekend, where I sent to Trev a list of horror films that every Halloween season, I like, in the last few years actually, I like to watch a bunch of stuff I've never seen before. I am notoriously bad at rewatching movies ad nauseum. So usually I ask Trev, I was like, what should I watch? And then he gives me a list, and then I try to get through them right before October 31st. So he discovered that I'd never seen Bram Stoker's Dracula. So the one that we just talked about with Gary Oldman. So I was like, you know what, I really finally need to watch that, especially before this episode of the podcast. And that movie is awesome. Like it is a filmmaker's movie. If you love the art of filmmaking, Coppola basically uses every damn way of doing film. Like it's very, very cool. I had a great time with it. Keanu is atrocious, and there's really no defending that at all in any way, shape, or form. But everything else is just like super, super good, and I'm so glad I finally watched it. And then here we are, and I watched Dracula Untold. So I haven't seen a lot of Dracula movies, but I've seen many, many, many vampire entertainment in the world. Like some of my favorite things have been vampire orientated, such as Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel. But when it comes to the titular character, I have not watched too much stuff. So I think this is going to be like a fun discussion, especially with your historical background and like the plethora of knowledge you have versus my stupidity.
You're dumb, like kind of millennial, like movies didn't start until 1995 mentality or whatever. So we do actually have an episode of Buffy, Chris, with Dracula, which I'm sure you remember. not necessarily one of the most exciting, memorable portrayals
Yeah.
of the character there either, right? Not one of my favorites necessarily, although a fun episode ultimately. Great. So yeah, I think it's not any surprise to our listeners that you're a big dummy. So great, it's perfect. So we can talk about these two kind of different.
You know what, listeners, I have
here.
to say, first of all, I edit this podcast, and you have no idea what I've saved you from, okay? Trev may sound like he knows everything, and he makes no mistakes, and he doesn't stumble, but guess what? I spend hours, listeners, making him sound okay.
Cut to that half hour you cut out where I'm like, who's Dracula? What? And he quickly scouring a bunch of lists like, Christopher Lee. Okay, yeah, that sounds good.
You're just always slurring like you're drunk.
Well, I do get drunk before this. I'm not going to deny that. All right, well, let's talk about the Man of the Hour, or this version of the Man of the Hour, because obviously we are addressing that this is a character that's been interpreted and kind of reinvented many, many times. And so, it's kind of like any time you look into the terror teletype, which is what Fangoria used to always call their little, I think they still do, call their little update of what are the horror films in development. Pretty good bet you can find some Dracula films in there. Mm-hmm. At any time, there's kind of, there's Dracula's appearing in multiple cartoons, TV shows, movies, books, cinema. Right? As I said, he's a character in the public domain. He's just lasted, he's lived on so long, reinvented. And even today, like right now, Dracula's having a very hot moment. Just go look at how many Dracula films are in development, how many have been announced. You'll see there's like a bunch happening right now. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of always going on. So when you decide to do that, everyone wants to have their new take. Everyone wants to say, well, if I'm adding to the pile, what am I trying to figure out? And what we get in this sense is that back in 2007, around the time they are also developing Wolfman, as we said, Universal is starting to think about, this is still kind of in the wake of The Mummy. Maybe Van Helsing didn't quite blow up for them, but The Mummy was still popular enough that they're still trying to figure out all these other monsters that they have that come from their famous Universal Monsters franchise and trying to think how to reinvent them. And they say, well, what if we do like a Dracula origin film? Mm-hmm. And at that time, in 2007, it's announced that we are going to be getting a movie called Dracula Year Zero. Dracula Year Zero, this version of it, would have been directed by Alex Proyas, who most people probably know as the director of The Crow, Dark City, I, Robot, and then some lesser entries like Knowing and Gods of Egypt, right? Alex Proyas is, to me, one of those like really frustrating directors where if you look at his early stuff, I would have thought, it's surprising to me that today he's not one of my favorite directors.
Totally.
It's like how he comes out of the gate, and then I think that's like the third time I said coming out of the gate this episode. Like
see, listeners, see what I deal with, okay, okay, and I'm keeping all of them in.
Chris,
boys.
can you edit that out? Oh,
absolutely not.
But to see like the early stages of Alex Price and to like see where he goes is a little unfortunate. That's all I'm trying to say.
Sure.
This version was going to be directed by very notable kind of I guess you could almost say like super producer Michael DeLuca, and was scheduled to star Sam Worthington in the lead role. Sam Worthington, of course, Jake Sully from one of Chris and I's favorite films to defend, Avatar. Mm-hmm. So I kind of remember when this was out in the ether, this idea of Dracula Year Zero. I will say, Chris, I want to just quickly ask you about this. We're going to talk a little bit about our thoughts of like the leading man that we did get, but I don't think Sam Worthington would have been a very good Dracula. I feel like Bullet dodged here a little bit. Do you agree?
I agree, and I actually defend Sam Worthington. I think I've defended him.
He's a good Jake Sully for sure.
That's the main point, is that I defend Jake Sully. I don't know if I defend Sam Worthington.
Right.
They tried for a hot minute. They tried to like Hollywood likes to do, and as we've discussed in many of our episodes already, when somebody's hot and good, and the movie just blew up like Avatar did, all of a sudden they want to make Sam Worthington the new guy. And I even remember James Cameron talking when they were filming Avatar, and he was like, "This is going to be the next great thing." He like what we did with Leo. This is what we're going to do with Sam. And they tried, and every single time Sam Worthington shows up, he's giving a pretty lifeless thing. And I'm sure he's a nice guy, and we don't like talking shit about actors, but like definitely, I do think we'll talk about Luke Evans later, but Luke Evans may be the lesser of the two evils.
It's interesting because, I know, Chris, from our discussions, from hearing from some feedback from some of our listeners, I know it's controversial whenever you and I talk about which men are most handsome and who has the appropriate sexuality. But I will say, I think Dracula has to be, or it doesn't have to be necessarily, but for what this film is going for, there is a level of like sexiness to Dracula and a kind of raw sexuality, which I just don't see Sam Worthington having. Sam Worthington clearly like a very handsome leading man, but I don't know that he could have been the kind of sexuality I'm talking about is a sexy, dangerous, right?
Yeah.
And that's not what Sam Worthington is. And I will say that's, Luke Evans has that a little bit. So to me, that actually is like a trade up in that.
Yeah, it's the
degree, at least.
Luke Evans, the Henry Cavill, like it's that kind of thing. It's like, yeah, I get it for sure.
Yeah,
I know you don't like. I know you think, whatever his name is, Brandon Routh is better looking than Henry Cavill.
I stand by this. I stand by this. Come at me, people. But anyways, you know what? Next time I'll talk about my 5 sexiest Draculas. How about that?
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. But yeah, Sam Worthington does not end up going through, and neither does Alex Proyas. So that kind of falls apart. And then in February 10th, 2012, Hollywood announces that an Irish director by the name of Gary Shore comes into talks to direct. And ultimately, that is who we get signing on. And at that point, the film is also rewritten from going from Dracula Year Zero. It morphs into Dracula Untold. And Chris already mentioned that our 2 writers who could take on the new bulk of this are Matt Sazama and the oddly named Burke Sharpless.
Do you know how Gary Shore kind of got the gig here?
I do, but why don't you tell us about it, Chris?
Yeah, producer Alyssa Phillips, who we have a few things that we're gonna regurgitate, I guess, what she said. But she was very taken with Shore's short film called A Cup of Tears. She pointed out it's incredibly stylized, and there's such an aesthetic and a vision there. I wanted to meet him. So in that short film, she saw something to hand over, $70 million plus to this guy. And I've never seen the short, and perhaps it's amazing. But again, the people that made this movie, the creatives, are first timers, which I think is very, very important.
Yes, and I think we'll address why. And I will say, beyond just being taken with a cup of tears, Alyssa Phillips also mentions that it's about kind of the pitch she brought into the room. She says, when I met him, he read the script. Yeah, that's pretty good. You do want them to do that. And continuing her quote, the first thing he said was, it's a father-son story. And for us, that was exactly what we wanted to hear, because he went right for character. There's a lot in the script. There's a lot of spectacle. There's visual effects. There's tons of cool stuff. And a lot of directors would have been like, oh my God, I can't wait to shoot the hand of bats or things like that. But he smartly went for what makes a film great, which is the character. So, she's kind of drawn to him coming in and saying, well, I really very much see this as a character-driven piece. I see this as a father-son story. And in fact, ultimately makes it sound like maybe, in terms of at least how he pitched it, he was less interested in some of the supernatural elements. And that's something I know you and I are also going to talk about.
Definitely.
But as in producer thinking, I could see being swayed by this, like, oh, I see it as a father-son story, right? I'm really going to get to the heart of that. It'll be interesting to talk about what we see in the movie from those comments, but I guess I get it. I don't know.
Well, it's kind of like Transformers. It's about a boy in his car. And then there becomes there's robot testicles. It's just an interesting left turn.
Yeah. The road there has a lot of detours very often. Yeah. So with Sam Worthington out, but we have a new director, new writers, we do need a new leading man, and so we turn to a Trevor Snyder favorite. And in 2013, it is announced that Luke Evans, good old Luke, has come onto the cast to replace Worthington to play this version of Dracula, the man who will become Dracula in Dracula Untold. Now, we've talked about Luke Evans briefly in our Three Musketeers episode. I just briefly alluded to this in the beginning. Do I ultimately really have that much against Luke Evans? No, not necessarily. I just point to him as like another example of what Chris was just talking about, this desire by Hollywood to take somebody and try to kind of quickly make them a thing. And it kind of always stumbling and not quite working. And I think Luke Evans fits into that mold. I think, to me, it seems like there's been multiple times where we've gotten a Luke Evans movie and there's been a little bit of talk about how, oh, this is the guy, like, right, he's ready to take that next step. And it just never seems to happen. And this is a weird one because I like to kind of joke about that with him. But honestly, I'm not sure I can necessarily put my finger on what it is that's holding him back necessarily, because actually, if I'm being honest, I don't really think he's that bad. I agree, he was kind of fun in Three Musketeers. We'll talk about his performance in this, but he's certainly a very handsome man. As I said, I do think he actually has the kind of dangerous sexuality quality to him that is more necessary for this part than Worthington. But what are your just overall thoughts on Luke Evans? Are you a fan, or do you kind of see where I'm coming from? What do you think?
I see where you're coming from in the sense that he's like that long list of actors that Hollywood's trying to make happen but just aren't happening. But yeah. Like I do enjoy his presence. Like I think like him in Furious 6 as the villain. I think he's pretty awesome in that movie. I think he fits in really good with the material, and I know that movie's kind of a, just a big dumb movie, of course. But he works in those scenarios. I think maybe that's where they go awry with him, is that they maybe force him into a too serious, too quickly role, almost like too much meat on the bones, so to speak. And I don't know if it's like, I don't know if he's like good at it. Like, I don't know. I don't want to say mean things, but it's just like I'm thinking of like the Hobbit trilogy, and like those movies are so self-serious. I mean, to their detriment, I think. And then I think he is just like a nothing burger in it. You know what I mean?
And that really should be the role that kind of blew him up, right? That's where, like today, like you should be like, oh yeah, Bard the Bowman. That's the iconic moment where Luke Evans really became Luke Evans megastar. But that didn't happen.
He should have had the Orlando Bloom moment, And I joked about it in our Three Musketeers about him being sort of like discount Orlando Bloom, which also he's in Three Musketeers as well, which was funny. But I always feel like him and Orlando Bloom especially, I always equate them, and I sometimes have a hard time remembering which movies they were in.
Yeah. Well, Luke Evans is like the slightly more buff Orlando Bloom, if that helps.
Totally.
I'd say.
Totally.
Yeah. I didn't see, I have to be honest, I didn't see the live action remake of Beauty and the Beast, because why would I bother? It just looked like one of those,
he's in there too.
1-to-1. Playing Gaston, who you would hope, I don't know, I haven't heard too much about his performance just because I didn't hear much about that movie, but I hope he was good in that, because that's a very fun character, right? You hope that maybe that stretched him out a little in terms of a performance. But
well, now that you mention it, now it's rushing back to me that I saw that movie, and he is good in that movie. And again, it's a movie that doesn't take itself way too seriously. It's just like a fun kind of bombastic musical, and he actually does a pretty great job as Gaston. Now that I remember,
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Right. Yeah. So maybe, like Luke Evans, if you're listening, and I know you are, don't worry. There's still time for you to win me back. I'm not saying you're not a lost cause to me yet. I'm just acknowledging that maybe Hollywood's done you a little dirty so far by trying to go too far, too fast with you.
I like to think
too fast,
that,
too furious.
Sorry. All right, you're fired. I like to think that he's like can't sleep at night thinking about our podcast, and he's like this Michigander, this son of a bitch.
He started listening because he's a huge Gem of the Holograms fan. He found that episode first, got very excited.
Yes.
Went back and did the whole back catalog, and he's like, oh, they're doing Dracula Untold? Well, I can't wait to hear what they say about me. And you heard the first couple bits, he's like, oh, Trev doesn't like me. Well, I hope he listened this long. Luke, I'm still rooting for you, all right?
Yeah.
Now, if you have cast Luke Evans and you've made Trevor, of 2014 a little nebulous about this, and you want to win me back and get me to be a little interested, well, you do cast Sarah Gaydon to play the female lead. So, Chris, you and I have never had an opportunity to talk about Sarah Gaydon, another Canadian. But what many of my other friends know, and you do not know, is that Sarah Gaydon, for me today, is one of my current biggest crushes in cinema.
Okay.
I think Sarah Gaydon is gorgeous, and I often point to Sarah Gaydon as an actress who is another one who I feel like, man, Hollywood is just not handling her right. I feel like she should be such a bigger star. So I first found Sarah Gaydon when she appeared in Cosmopolis, the 2012 David Cronenberg film, alongside Robert Pattinson. Not a movie I was necessarily taken with, but one of the main things I talked about coming out of the film was, did you see this Sarah Gaydon? Like, did you guys? No, I mean, did you guys see her? Actually, it might have been. I noticed that Dangerous Method is 2011. She's in that as well. So she has this kind of string of films with Cronenberg. She also appears in his Map to the Stars film, 2014. And then we see her in like Enemy, and then it's just kind of really clocking, where she would pop up, and it's not too much big stuff, right? Ultimately, she's also the female lead in the Hulu miniseries 11/22/63, which is the Stephen King novel about the time travel and the JFK assassination. That is kind of saddled by a very miscast James Franco in the lead role, but she's awesome in it. And I don't know, I'm just always really taken with her. I just I don't want to be like creepy dude, but I just do think, Chris, last time you talked about that kind of traditional classical Hollywood beauty look.
Totally.
I think Sarah Gaydon just has that so much. Like, she just, like, cameras want to film her so bad because she's just drop dead gorgeous. And I also think she's very charismatic. I think she's a very, very strong actress who has just not been utilized right. So I was excited that she was the lead in this.
What can I tell you? Us Canadians, we're beautiful people. We're incredible talents. And you're welcome.
Did you really know much about her going into this, or had you seen her in anything, or?
I did not. I think in our group message, her name popped up during one of our Matrix moments a few weeks ago. Doesn't matter if I already said too much. But she did pop up, and she doesn't ring a bell for me. Would you agree
that she's pretty?
I think she's gorgeous.
Okay, good. So I wanted to make sure.
Trev, hold on. I may cut this. I'm just like. I got this. But like, she's my type.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I
I
might
don't think
cut
you need to cut that. Yeah, I think it's fine.
Okay.
Maybe she's listening. Maybe she'll reach out. Well, don't cut it, Chris. This could be the love connection. This,
I know
someday...
you finally get to meet Luke Evans and make out, and then I can get Sarah Gaten.
Oh wow. Just making some notes for my dream bank tonight. Anyways, one sec. I'm trying to remember who the next. Oh yeah. Okay. Another important actor I want to address in terms of who else is getting cast in this, and this is another one who I think, Chris, I know that you're like on the same page with me, but I'm not 100% sure. But that is Dominic Cooper. Dominic Cooper also joins to play the villain. Now, Dominic Cooper, another one. This is interesting. This is a cast full of people who I would say should maybe be bigger stars than they are, and have maybe just not found the right material. To me, Dominic Cooper is also an actor I find just kind of effortlessly and endlessly entertaining in almost everything I see him in. And in fact, I'll bring up Dominic Cooper again a little later in the review. But what are your thoughts on just Dominic Cooper? Do you like him? I mean, I know he's not necessarily a household name, but people, of course, know him as the young version of Howard Stark in the MCU. That's probably his most noted mainstream role. But of course, kind of comes to prominence originally with his brilliant work in the film The Devil's Double. Played Jesse Custer on The Preacher Show. I thought he was quite good in that.
Right.
What are your thoughts on Dominic Cooper?
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo everything you say. I think we're on the exact same pages about him. He's very charismatic. Every time he pops up in anything, I'm like, oh, hey, there's Dominic Cooper. It's one of those moments, those kind of actors that I like to see.
He's got that John Leguizamo vibe, right? Where you're just always happy to see him. You're like, oh, if he's in this, at least his scenes are going to be pretty entertaining.
Yeah.
Right? So you can always feel good about that. And speaking of people you're always excited to see, let's talk about the other big casting here, and what was ultimately meant to be one of the most important bits of casting, which we'll talk about in a moment, is Charles Dance. Yes. Charles Dance playing the master vampire in this. Charles Dance rules. What more do we need to say? I mean, like, whatever we just said about Dominic Cooper, times that like by 1,000. The second Charles Dance comes on screen, you were just like, I'm in the presence of a master vampire, but also master actor, master character actor, and you're just always so happy. And if you want to class up this kind of movie, you bring in Charles Dance.
Yeah, he is incredibly reliable screen presence. Like in the best sense. Like, not that he's like lesser than. It's just Charles Dance shows up and you're immediately happy. And he kind of reminds me of Bill Nighy a little bit in these types of genre films. Like, when Bill Nighy shows up in Underworld and you're like, oh, fucking sweet, Bill Nighy's in this movie. It's like this. Is when Charles Dance shows up in this, he showed up in...
kind of like when Charles Dance shows up in Underworld and you're like, oh, wow, Charles Dance is in this and he belongs, right?
Oh, shit, he's in there too. Yeah. Well, we should watch Underworld.
Actually, let's turn this off and let's go watch Underworld.
Yeah, no, I just... Every time he pops up, he's awesome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also, like, I think the thing that, like, when you were saying the thing about Bill Nighy, I think that's exactly right. Not Bill Nighy the science guy, everybody. We're talking about Bill Nighy the actor. But the thing about both of them is that they feel like they can be in this kind of, like, classical Oscar award bait kind of movie.
Yep.
And then films like this. And sometimes you have actors who show up in movies like this and you feel like they're slumming it, right? Like, oh, what are they doing here? You never get that sense with a Charles Dance. You never get that sense with Bill Nighy. Instead, you feel like they're so excited to be in these movies.
Totally.
Because they get to just have a blast, overact, be silly, play monsters like they probably did as kids. So they're always they bring such a vitality to it because they're bringing this kind of more classical acting style to this, B-movie schlock, which I say lovingly. Mm-hmm. I'd also just want to briefly mention a couple bits of casting, just because it's kind of interesting that we end up not seeing them, and that is that Samantha Barks in July of 2013, it's announced that Samantha Barks has joined the cast as the Eastern European folktale character known as Baba Yaga, who, Chris, we saw in the Hellboy remake that we looked at. So she plays a beautiful young woman who transforms into a savage witch. Now, if you've seen the film before and you're listening to our episode and you're going, what are you guys talking about? That's because her scenes were all later cut. And maybe you and I later can talk about where we think that might have gone, but I just think that's interesting that she's not in there. And significantly enough, to the same end, Charlie Cox. Charlie Cox, who the world now knows as the Netflix Daredevil, perhaps soon to be seen again in the MCU. I don't know. But he was also cast in this, and apparently he filmed scenes which also did not end up in the film. So I just thought that's interesting to, again, show how... we're about to talk about that in a second, but that's kind of indicative of how the final version of this we see is maybe not 100% the version everyone set out to make.
Speaking of things that were cut and reshot, Trev, you have some information about the final scene of the film, which we'll just spoil here because, it's a little bit of behind-the-scenes stuff, so we want to get this out of the way.
Yeah, and I think we can kind of talk around it and talk about it a little bit more in our review, but I think what I was just saying is how I mentioned that the film we see is maybe not necessarily the original version of this they thought they were making. So as they're filming this, Universal starts thinking more about this potentially being the beginning of a cinematic universe for them. I don't know if that came out of them seeing the dailies and getting excited about it, or just realizing, well, hey, we're making this Dracula film. We know we're trying to aim for, more of these connections. While this film is being made, they are starting the development in the Mummy reboot, which we'll be looking at shortly. So a lot of people in Universal kind of perk up and say, well, actually, this Dracula Untold, right, since we're putting it forward as the beginning of this character, this introduction, this origin story, maybe this can be the first film in that series. So during production, they kind of decide to add a scene to the end of this film, a scene that was never originally planned to be in it, I guess was not in the original script, and that is a scene that flash forwards to the future, to the modern day, because obviously this is an origin story taking place in the far past. So we have a modern day scene, which is very much our post Iron Man credits, Avengers tease kind of rallying scene to set up where this series could be going. So we'll talk about the scene itself when we talk about the review, but I think just the fact that it's very well known that this was a late addition. This was something they threw in, and Gary Shore has even was asked about at the time, saying, well, is this film meant to be the beginning of a series? And he acknowledged that he did this scene for them almost like a favor, right? He said he did the scene, and then he said, right, it's optional for them if they want to use it as that launching pad. So he's kind of admitting, like, I don't necessarily see the film that way, but I gave them the scene if they want to use it. The pieces are in place now for them to ultimately have this. And, in a moment we'll talk about whether that worked or, kind of the irony of that scene in retrospect. But I do just think it was interesting that just during the making of this, they're like, ooh, maybe this could be a little bit more, and throwing this little bit in.
Actually, Trev, we do have some evidence of the reshoots and shuffling, and it comes in the form of a release date. I don't know if you know about this.
I don't. I remember that with the Wolfman, but I wasn't as aware of it with this one.
So this was originally announced to be released August 8th, 2014. Mm-hmm. It was then announced 4 months later that the film would be postponed until October 3rd, 2014. Then it was pushed again to October 17th. And then in a strange shuffling, they pushed it back to October 10th, 2014 to give the film 3 weeks of play before Halloween. Because, as we'll get to, Trev, this is the ultimate Halloween picture.
Yeah, of course. It's interesting that first release date very much was like, hey, this is a summer film, right? And I think that's maybe where they're seeing it. And maybe at some point someone said, well, no, maybe we can push this as a Halloween film. Perhaps as we talk about the movie, Chris, we can talk about, is this either of those things?
Well, let's get into it.
Let's do it.
I have been waiting an eternity for a man of your strength. What kind of man crawls into his own grave in search of hope?
A desperate one. The Turks threaten to destroy my kingdom. They're almost here. I want the power to save my people. Save my family.
Your salvation is in the dark and all its power.
Welcome to your life.
You will have the strength of 100 men.
There's no turning back.
And dominion over the night and all its creatures.
At what price?
You have no idea. But I'm going to show you. Drink.
What's happening to you?
I chose this.
Why?
Because men do not fear swords.
He is coming.
They fear monsters.
This is not who we are.
Do you think you are alive? Because you can fight? You are alive because of what I did to save you!
The world.
Never forget who I am.
Trained to become a fearless warrior, Vlad the Impaler now maintains a frail peace with the Turks, ruling peacefully over 15th century Transylvania. However, when the former brother-in-arms, Sultan Mehmed, demands 1,000 boys, including Vlad's only son, as soldiers for the Turkish army, the prince will have no other choice but to rebel. In despair, Vlad reluctantly makes a pact with the monstrous but all-powerful creature of the dark Broken-Tooth Mountain to destroy his enemies. But now an even greater challenge awaits. Will Vlad the vampire lose his soul to save his kingdom? Let's talk about it.
Spoiler alert, he will, because it's called Dracula Untold. All right. Chris, let me start with my general thoughts in this film, because, for me, this was a rewatch. I know this is your first time watch. As often, we have not talked about how we felt about it. I'll just give away the ghost a little bit and say I'm not the biggest fan of this movie, as maybe you could tell from some earlier comments I made. And let me just kind of right off the bat express what I think is the biggest hurdle that this film has that it doesn't overcome, and in fact, it just falls victim to. And that is ultimately, what's the point of a prequel as we know it? Now, I'm not the biggest fan of prequels in general. You and I have talked about that a lot. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, what are you asking a prequel to do? A prequel is meant to give us backstory for characters that we already know and love in a way that also gives us new information about them that we never had. Or that's the ultimate ideal version of a prequel. If the prequels that work to whatever level are telling us more about a character and heightening our familiarity with the character, giving us new facets we didn't realize before, that all still feels in service of what we have seen. But the issue with making a prequel to Dracula is that, as I mentioned earlier in the episode, Dracula is a character that has been interpreted many, many times. There's not one singular version of Dracula. And in fact, this film, Dracula Untold, is not a prequel to the Bram Stoker Dracula, when there's evidence of that throughout, which we'll talk about. So why I think this way doesn't work is that this is a prequel film to a series that hasn't happened yet. This is a prequel film for a character we have no familiarity with. This is a prequel film to a hypothetical version of Dracula that does not exist, and because we never got sequels, will never exist. So it's a very, very confusing film, because the entire time you're wondering, well, what is this film trying to tell me about Dracula? Because all the pressure is on this movie to establish their version. And I think the problem here is that, as we mentioned, they wanted to make this superhero version of Dracula. This was very much, our Dark Universe take on the Universal Monsters is going to be MCU inspired. Mm-hmm. So here you have a Dracula Untold that ultimately, I sit down to watch this, you're saying this is a prequel for Dracula. I want this to be a supernatural version of Breaking Bad. I want this to be the story of how this good man becomes one of history and literature and horror's greatest villains. And that is not what this film is. This is a superhero film.
Yeah.
A superhero film. It's a superhero origin movie with just the littlest bits of Dracula mixed in so they can sell it as a Dracula film. And as a horror fan and as a Dracula fan, that annoys me, that frustrates me throughout. And so even though I think there's some things that work in this film, I think ultimately on just terms of pure craft and storytelling, this is not a great film, but it's pretty serviceable, right? Mm-hmm. I'd say it's a pretty average film. But I think that why it didn't succeed and why you had a lot of people kind of turn on it like me is that at the end of the day, I'm like, what is this version of Dracula you're trying to sell me? Superman Dracula? Not super interested. So I have obviously more to say about that throughout the review, but that's my biggest problem with this.
Okay, I want to lead with director Gary Shore. He has a quote here saying, "Anybody who's going to the film expecting a horror film is going to be sorely disappointed. For me, it was telling a story. I was trying to tell a good drama that has action-adventure elements to it." Okay. So, a little bit misguided going into Dracula film, just kind of what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
But they wanted to make a 4-quadrant film. That's what this movie is. Like you said, it's a superhero origin story with Dracula hints in it. Mm-hmm. Me personally, I would rename this Drag You Blah. Because honestly, I watched this 2 nights ago, and I'm struggling to remember it. Truly, this morning I was at work, and one of my coworkers was like, "Oh, you're recording tonight, right?" I was like, "Yeah." She goes, "Well, what'd you think?" "Oh, you're not going to tell me." And I was like, "It's not that I don't want to tell you. It's that I am having a very hard time remembering." Mm-hmm. And that's why, this is not a bad movie. This is not a piece of trash dumpster fire. It's not. It's competent. Mm-hmm. But I think what it is that exactly what you're saying. I think this is the first time in a long time where I think me and you are completely on the same page. Mm-hmm. I think that this movie is just, it's blah. It's
Blah.
yeah. I was waiting. Thank you. I only had to say it twice, but okay. All right. This is about nice guy Dracula.
Yeah.
And that is so strange. It's trying to be Lord of the Rings, King Arthur, and Iron Man. And in doing so, it loses the plot of the reason why I'm sitting here, the reason why I'm watching a Dracula movie. So I think we have a lot to say, but that is really what I feel. I think this is just a misguided, boring take, even though they had the best intentions. But as some people I know, and one of my favorite movies of all time says, some of the worst things have been done with the best intentions. So that's how I feel about this film.
Yeah, it's weird because you watch the entire film waiting for that last domino to tip over.
Yeah.
Right? Waiting for that moment where, oh, okay, this is where he goes from being the heroic prince of the film to turning into the Dracula that we know. Or at least a version of the Dracula that we know, right? That's what you're waiting for the entire film, and it never happens. And what makes it even ultimately more frustrating is the film establishes a thesis early on that you think is going to be the central point, and you're kind of behind and you're waiting for, and it never pays it off. We have the character at a certain point in the scene, as he kind of goes to this master vampire and asks him, can you give me your powers so I can use them to defeat the Turks, right? The Turks are threatening my people. I am their leader. I want to be a good leader. I want to defend them. So I want to have your vampire abilities for a little bit to do this. And the master vampire, played by Charles Dance, is explaining to Vlad Dracula, like, well, just so you know, if I give you these powers, it is a curse, right? There's some sort of rules to follow. Why would you want this curse? You've seen what, I'm forced to be a monster and live in this cave. Do you really want to take this on? You're a hero to your people. And we have Vlad Dracula say, sometimes the world doesn't need a hero. Sometimes what it needs is a monster. That line is used in some of the trailers. That's like a poster line if I've ever seen it. That's exactly what the thesis should be for this movie. And I watched the entire movie, and throughout, and one of the main things I wrote on my paper, and I circled it 2 times on my little note sheet here, is, where's the monster?
Yeah.
Right? You had him talk about how I'm giving up my ability to be a hero to become the monster my people need. And he doesn't become a monster. He becomes a superhero. He becomes a superhero who can turn into bats. He becomes a superhero who can walk out onto a battlefield by himself and defeat all the villains. But the thing is, everything he does throughout this film is completely justified.
Yeah.
Every single moment, every single, dastardly thing we do, I can't even say dastardly, every supernatural thing we do, every superpowered moment we see him do is all in service of the right cause. And that's where this film is just so confused, because I don't understand... Yeah, why? Okay, so this isn't Dracula as I know it. It's just very, very weird.
Yeah, he's always killing and fighting the bad guys.
Right.
He never turns on the good guys.
Yes.
So much so that there's a scene that it just shows you that this movie was edited to shit, by the way. Let me set up a little bit of the backstory here. So he, like Trev said, the master vampire gives him his powers. But this is where this is actually an interesting part that I liked about the movie. He gives him the 3-day ticking clock. Mm-hmm. I love a ticking clock, a plot device. I think it's an easy way to get drama, but it's effective. And here you're watching Vlad. He's vamped out now, and he is not allowed to drink blood. So for 3 days, he has to defeat the Turks, but he cannot drink a sip of blood. If he does, he's going to be a vampire forever. So
and of course he feels that thirst a lot, right? That's the point, right? Like he's so driven by the thirst. He has all the abilities of the vampire. He so wants to drink. And we have those great moments where he's like making love to his wife, and suddenly he sees her neck, and we get that cool vampire vision shot where the neck suddenly starts glowing, and he just wants to dig in and chomp on it, which is Sarah Gay, and I don't blame him. Anyways, but yeah, so we have that ticking clock, yes.
Yeah, and I love that. The weird part, though, is because obviously he can't travel during the day. Mm-hmm. So he comes up with this idea to tell his army. First of all, I don't understand why he's telling the army to run away from the Turks, because he has all these vampire powers now, and he can bat burst. He just bursts into bats whenever he wants.
Every time they go into battle with them, he easily defeats them. Then he's like, let's keep running away. Oh? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And
he just one guy takes out hundreds of guys. Mm-hmm. And it's very strange, but regardless, fine. Let's go with the bad movie logic at this point. He says to his army, okay, run away. And in a day, I'll catch up with you. I promise. I just got shit to do. Okay? So they all just kind of like...
I got some paperwork to file.
Yeah, like... I collect stamps.
Yeah.
So they leave, and during the day he obviously sleeps, and then as soon as it goes dark out, he bat bursts and he flies to them in this forest. Well, they're being attacked by the Turks at this point. So he comes in and he fucking annihilates all the bad guys, okay? Mm-hmm. So it's like a great hero moment, as Trev's been saying. It's a great hero moment. There's no villainy? What do I say? Villainy, okay. There's no villainy happening. Now, cut to the next day. Reminder, everyone, he has saved his entire army, okay? And there's really still no exact evidence as to how or why he is who he is. So all of a sudden, they're at their little encampment, licking their wounds, so to speak. And all of a sudden, Vlad's army gets a hint that he's a monster for no reason other than a light shines into his tent. He burns up a little bit, but dude, he burns up in the tent. Nobody can see him, okay? His entire army turns on him immediately and starts burning his tent, freaking out. Oh, Vlad's a monster. He's a monster. Oh, let's kill him. Reminder, Vlad just saved these people. So, as a viewer, I'm watching my hero being taken out of context, and his loyal band of people are attacking my hero. I'm on his side. I'm like, fucking kill these guys. Or something. Just like, I'm truly baffled as to how we even get to that place. So again, what Trev is saying, we only see heroic acts being taken place. Like what he should have. Sorry, I'm getting heated.
Well, no, I'll tell you something, Chris, because I'll tell you what's even more doubly wrong with that scene.
Okay.
Because, and this is something I'll allude to earlier, as I know we want to talk about this near the end, but that scene, you're right, that how it builds up is like very poorly handled. The fact that they somehow just suddenly know he's a vampire, whatever, that's pretty sloppy. But beyond this moment you're talking about where his men turn on him, this is where I say, like, when you're watching this thinking you're watching a supernatural Breaking Bad about how this hero is turned into a villain, this is that moment, right? What's even doubly frustrating is that this comes in the middle of the film, and the resolution of this is they set him on fire, then he walks out of the fire, and he basically just, like, chastises them, right? Yeah. He comes out and he says, hey, guys, come on now. I know I got these bad powers, but I did it for you. And he's like shaking his fingers at them. Maybe it's a little bit more dramatic than that. Maybe I'm, but he's saying like, guys, I did this for you. And in that moment, they all kind of just go like, all right, I guess, maybe he's right. Maybe we overreacted. Yeah. Right? And that's where I, as a viewer, just for the rest of the movie, I'm pretty checked out now because I think that's where the film missed its opportunity. And I'll talk about this later about how I'm gonna share like what I would do differently. But I think here you've screwed up the ultimate dramatic turning point of your film. And instead, you've had the people realize what he is. You've had the people briefly treat him as a monster, but then accept him. So now, not only do you have a hero story continuing, which it shouldn't be, but now you're doubling up on that to say you have a hero story, and now the hero is backed by an entire army of people who know what he is and accept it. And or even let's just say it now. Later on, he shares his powers with them. And we get an entire army of heroic vampires. Yeah. Vampires who, again, we are watching fight the movie's villains. Yes, we see them being pretty brutal in the battle. Yes, we see them doing kind of monstrous things. But the problem is, at this point in the film, we have only been shown their enemies to be so much worse. The Turks are trying to steal children and make them into child soldiers. They are awful. They are evil. The film has hammered that point home repeatedly. So when this army of vampires is just destroying them, we as viewers are like, yep, they deserve that. And that's the thing. Everything the vampires do in this movie is completely justified. And that's what I think is weird.
I have never heard a bad guy, want boys so badly. Okay? Like, the whole time, we're owed 1,000 boys. Give me my boys. Where are my 1,000 boys? And it's like, this includes Dracula's kid. So, of course, as the viewer, I'm like, no, fuck that shit. Like, kill these Turks, So it's very frustrating. And you just hit on another point that makes it all the more underwhelming from a monstrous point of view. Is you said they brutalize people. Okay. Mm-hmm. You said it, yeah. but they don't really brutalize. They're doing it in kind of PG-13, very light PG-13, by the way. ways. So this movie, we haven't even really mentioned it yet, but this movie is bloodless. Like, there's a little bit here and there, but really, dude, like, it is bloodless. Some may say toothless. But this goes back to producer Alyssa Phillips, who we mentioned before, and the reason why she hired Gary Shore. She's a couple things to say here. We want kids to enjoy this. Blood is an omnipresent, iconic story point of vampirism. We can't deny that. But gore doesn't have to be. If you want to see a film about Vlad the Impaler, this is probably not it. And she goes on to say about being particularly appealing by working with Gary Shore was his aversion to making this a gore-heavy vampire film. She notes, "We didn't want to make an R-rated, gory horror film. We say a lot, this isn't your father or your grandfather's Dracula. It's going to be very different." Now, Trev, okay. This is about the big bad vampire of all vampires, okay? Yeah. Daddy D himself, okay? There's more blood in, I think, like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which was a fucking TV show.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I know when I think Dracula, I say, I sure hope that movie doesn't have any blood in it. And, let me tell you what's even more frustrating about that quote, because she mentions how she says, if you're coming to a film about Vlad the Impaler, I guess this ain't it. Well, then why'd you make a movie about Vlad the Impaler?
Yeah.
Let me tell you another frustrating thing about this film is this is another one of his now many Dracula adaptations to adopt this idea of, well, let's have Dracula actually be Vlad Dracula, Vlad the Impaler, this famous historical figure. So, Chris, I'm sure you know like a little bit about this, but the actual historical character, or not character, the actual historical person of Vlad Dracula, Vlad the Impaler, Vlad III, famous 15th century Romanian ruler, was known for many battles with the Ottoman Empire. And obviously gets his nickname for his, legendary brutality, this idea that he would take his enemies, kill them, and impale them on stakes outside of his kingdom, right? So this is kind of the very famous thing about him. So we know, Vlad Dracula, we know his name, the name Dracula means son of Dracul. Dracul meaning the devil. Vlad Dracula's dad was Vlad Dracul. So we have the son of the devil, essentially. And that's kind of referenced in this. Or there's kind of some, debate about whether it's the devil or dragon. We've seen kind of both in fiction. I ultimately just bring this up to make the point that it's become very, very commonplace for people to look at, Bram Stoker named his novel Dracula. He was clearly inspired by his character. Let's just combine the two in our adaptations. Well, here's why there's a slight issue with that. So, Chris, I don't know how much of this you know, because I think maybe if you're just going along with what a lot of Hollywood storytellers want to tell you, you might think like, yeah, of course, Dracula is Vlad the Impaler. He's Vlad Dracul. And we've seen this used in many interpretations, most famously in one of the ones I quite like that we just talked about, Bram Stoker's Dracula. Yeah. We get that whole prologue here. And in fact, a lot of this movie feels like it's trying to be like a 90-minute adaptation of the first 5 minutes of Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Totally.
Right? Like giving us that whole origin. The beginning, the opening prologue is very much stylistically designed to look like that. But here's the thing. I'm gonna read you something that Elizabeth Miller is a professor emerita at Memorial University at Newfoundland in Toronto.
Oh, another Canadian. You're welcome.
Yeah, she had this to say about Bram Stoker's influence in writing this film. She says, Stoker apparently did not know much about Vlad the Impaler. Certainly not enough for us to say that Vlad was the inspiration for Count Dracula. So in fact, Bram Stoker's whole idea to write a vampire novel comes from him finding an article about Transylvania superstitions. So it's about Romanian and Transylvania superstitions, and it talks about vampires, and that's what gives him the idea. At the same time, he's read a book by William Wilkinson called Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia with Political Observations Relative to Them. And this just mentions this famous kind of figure, Vlad Dracula, Vlad the Impaler. And he thinks, that's a cool name. Oh, that's a guy who murdered a lot of people? Kind of has this sinister name. All right, I guess I'll use that. And that only comes in later drafts. In most of the initial drafts of his novel, he's calling the Count Vampire, or vampire with what's spelled Wampyr, right? So this whole thing about Dracula, as Bram Stoker saw him, being heavily influenced by Vlad the Impaler is not true. It's just something people have adopted over time and people are convinced themselves of. And I get it, because Vlad Dracula, the real historical Vlad Dracula, is this character with a lot of brutality and murder behind him, although today he's also often seen as a Romanian hero. There's kind of both aspects of him, but you can see that connection. Okay, so you decide that you're going to use that as your historical character again and say, okay, this is about Vlad the Impaler. The Impaler. That word makes me think I'm going to see people impaled left and right?
Yeah.
And then you make that decision, and then you have the nerve to do an interview and say, if you want to see a movie about Vlad the Impaler, this isn't it, right? This is more of like a bloodless superhero film. What are you doing? This I just, again, you say that they had the best intentions. I think some people did. I think some people involved in this movie were very, very confused about what kind of movie they wanted to make.
Well, our leading man, Luke Evans, he for sure knew the movie he wanted to make.
They are like superhero qualities. I mean, he has these incredible powers of flight and transformation and morphing into animals and be able to speak in your mind and create and control your body. I mean, it's and morph into the darkness and all of this stuff. There's a lot of stuff he can do, which is really great to use, but to do it in an effective way and not just to sort of like show off with what he can do. You know, he uses it when he needs to use it, but in essence, he is still a human being, and his emotions are still very human, and he's very loyal, and I hope I've made him very relatable, so that it's not just a story about a vampire, which you can't relate to. It's a story about a human who turns into a vampire who still has human feelings. I think to most people who watch this film, he will be a hero. Yeah. He's not the straightforward hero that you'd expect, and in many senses, he's an anti-hero. But the reasons for the decisions he makes in the film come from most often a good place. We're using a time in history that was a very momentous time. It was a time when there was a lot of death, and there was a lot of darkness, and there was a lot of superstition, and there was a lot of Eastern folklore, Eastern European folklore that people sort of lived and breathed by, and we've merged that into this story. It's quite a few different genres, I would say. It's a mix of quite a few. There's obviously, you have the very human aspect of Vlad and his the reasons why he does the things. They come from a very sort of it comes from love, basically love and integrity and loyalty and devotion and heartbreak, and then so you have that sort of epic level of storytelling, and then you then have the vampiric element to the film, which is incredibly strong, and you know it's part of his makeup for most of the film. You know, this is who he is, and so you have quite a sort of thriller-esque feel to the film, and there is it's a huge, sweeping, epic story that we're telling here.
Yeah, I think, you hear it there. Like, so Luke Evans, I think, understood the assignment, right? He knew he was making a more super powered version. I guess this is a nice time to start talking about some performances. And Chris, here's the truth. I actually don't mind Luke Evans in this. I actually think he's, for what the film's asking him to do, I think he's pretty good, actually. Yep. I think he is, he is sexy in this, which you need. It does seem heroic, which is not what I'm looking for. But for this movie, he's fitting into that. I actually think if this movie had been a bigger deal, this could have been kind of a little bit more of a star-making role for him. I think he's just good enough that you don't feel like I'm not saying he's going to blow anyone away with this performance, but he does everything this film asks him to do, and you kind of do get on his side. I think the moments that you need to see the pain in him, I think the moments with his son are very effective. I think the pain on his face of losing his son, I think whenever we see him contemplating that, the moments where he's worried about the curse, he's good. I think he's actually a good Dracula. It's just not my Dracula. # not my Dracula.
I especially like the scene early on in the film where the Sultan is coming for his son, and he's letting the son go to not start a war, and his wife, played by Sarah Gaden, is like freaking out and is like, no, don't send our son. Like, you told us we would never do this. You said when we would be married, you would protect us forever. And he still lets the son go. And then he has like this great moment where he walks up to lead his son to the Turks. And then the Turks say something like, we expected more from you, or some shit.
Mm-hmm. We expected more resistance. Yeah.
More resistance. And all of a sudden, he just does this great moment where he looks at his son, looks up, kneels down, and just goes into his ear, "Run to your mother." Mm-hmm. And I loved that part. And you just know, like, he was just going to kick some ass. And this is like one of those moments where you're like, okay, we're going to see Vlad the Impaler do his thing. And it's just edited to shit. Like even me like explaining the scene, I got goosebumps. But it's just so poorly executed after, like in post-production, that it just ruins anything Luke Evans is doing, which I completely agree. I think he is very good in this. I think he would be a great Dracula if he got the right material and if it was handled better in post.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because like I said, playing like a kind of over-the-top villain in Fast 6 shows you that if this movie made that right call to, in the third act, shift him over to that, we could have got both versions, and he could have handled himself well. The movie only asks him to never play the heroic thing. Chris, feeding off, I know we're going to talk about a couple more performances briefly, but feeding off of what you just said about the battle scenes being edited to shit, we should mention, you already mentioned before about how haphazardly this movie seems in terms of its editing and just presentation. Mm-hmm. This is a 90-minute movie. And I know both of us were very excited to sit down and only have to watch a 90-minute movie.
Yeah.
And sometimes I feel like I said, but this is a movie where you can see that it was not supposed to be a 90-minute movie, right? It feels like a lot is missing here. So I just quickly jotted down some of what I think are evidence of this being edited to hell, because I'm just going to quickly share with you.
Sure.
So first of all, I don't know if you felt this way, but I felt that opening prologue, which is kind of giving the history of Vlad the Impaler, I wrote down, the beginning of this film feels like we're already 30 minutes into the film. Mm-hmm. Like, it's just so much being thrown at you right away. So that was the first thing. Now I was thinking of, where does Baba Yaga, where was she supposed to fit into this? I can only imagine that Baba Yaga was initially connected to the character of the Master Vampire, who I also know from doing some research was actually supposed to be Caligula. That was supposed to be one of the reveals of this film. That was in the script stage. They were talking about that in some of the set visits that reporters did at the time, and that does not make it into the final cut, this idea that he is Caligula. And they said, in fact, they might have been saving that for a reveal in one of the sequels. Wah, wah, right? But I do think, because he explains to Dracula when he gives him the powers that, for my curse to be lifted, I need you to fail this test, right? If you drink blood within the next 3 days, you will inhabit my curse. You will become this vampire, and I will be freed of my curse. That's very, very weird, because then you ask, first of all, isn't it strange that he hasn't been able to find anyone else to just turn into a vampire and lift this curse off of himself? But also, where did this curse come from? I can only assume he was cursed by Baba Yaga, and maybe that's kind of where this connection became, right? So I think that's the case. But also, it's just weird later, because we find out he is still a vampire at the end of the day, right? He's still also immortal, so I don't quite get it. It all doesn't add up, right? So there's some pieces missing there, clearly, okay? Now we know Charlie Cox was cut out, so whatever that was gone. There's a character that pops up about halfway through the film. We only see him once until the end of the film again. This is a character played by Zach McGowan. The character's name is Shelgim, and he is very much set up to be like a Renfield figure.
Yes, totally.
He approaches Dracula in the woods halfway through the film and basically seems to understand what he is and wants to kind of be an acolyte of Dracula. And he's given...
May I cut you off real quick?
Of course.
I loved this moment. This is where I was like, oh shit, we're getting old timey Renfield,
Yep.
and I love the idea of familiars. I love the idea of human beings that immediately give everything to their vampire counterpart, and in the hopes that they will be turned one day. And I find that so fascinating in every type of vampire movie or lore. I just love the idea of a familiar. So I just wanted to cut in there and be like, I was so in for that scene, but
yeah, I hope you weren't too in, because he disappears from the film after that one scene, and we don't see him again until the very end, when he does show up and inhabits this Renfield role very briefly, but in a way that just doesn't connect because we've only had that one scene with him. I have to imagine he was meant to be a bigger presence. And then finally, the biggest thing that I think is a victim of this film's editing is that ultimately there's this whole implied past relationship and friendship between Dracula and the Dominic Cooper character. Dominic Cooper here playing Sultan Mehmed II, who is the film's big villain. He is the son of the Sultan that had originally kidnapped Vlad Dracula as a boy and turned him into Vlad the Impaler, this great warrior for the Turks. And ultimately Dracula was able to get away from that and come back to Transylvania be this prince. But he has this relationship with Sultan Mehmed II. They're great friends. That's all just lip service in this.
Yeah.
It's talked about, but I never get a sense of their relationship, and that means that the villain is nothing in this. And that sucks, because it's Dominic Cooper, right? And you want Dominic Cooper to be awesome in this. You want to really feel the hatred between these two that used to be a friendship. And I just feel like most of that must have ended up on the cutting room floor, because they bring it up and they talk about it, but it's just not there. So I think this movie just shows that this was cut to hell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I think you're so right about especially where that Baba Yaga stuff was. I didn't even really think about where I would place it, but I think honestly, I think you're dead on.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the three supporting cast members left. Trev, who do you want to start with?
Let's just briefly talk about Dominic Cooper since I brought him up, because I don't have too much to say about him in this, because I do feel like, unfortunately, he's playing a very, very underdeveloped character. I did allude earlier that I wanted to say something about Dominic Cooper, and that is just that I was just kind of giving Luke Evans some props and saying I kind of like him in this. I will say, I remember when I originally saw this that I mentioned it. I thought at the time, this movie might be a little bit more interesting if you actually swapped his casting and had Dominic Cooper play Dracula. Because I think he would actually kind of bring a theatricality to it, because we know that's what Dominic Cooper excels at. That would have made this a little bit more of a fun character. Not to say Luke Evans is doing anything wrong, but because the film is so self-serious and dour, imagine if Dracula was just a little bit more, kind of had this psychotic glint in his eye, or was a little bit more over the top. I think that could be fun. Cool. I think Dominic Cooper in this is fine, I guess. It's a little uncomfortable that he is doing brown face. Right?
I wrote that down. I was like a young Howard Stark with a fake tan.
Oof, this is all the Turks in this. The Turks are just nothing but British actors doing brown face. So that's pretty unfortunate. But yeah, I guess he's whatever in this, unfortunately. An actor I like, but I don't know. I sat down to watch this again, didn't remember he was in it. So
yeah. Charles Dance, we've talked a little bit about him with The Master Vampire. Again, we like seeing him. I think he's giving a hammy, fun, theatrical performance. He's just not in it enough.
Nope.
Again, it's they have all this talent in front of them, and we have to say that it's a victim to the edit. It has to be, because the makeup is cool. He looks like an ancient vampire. He's selling it. A lot of the time when vampires in movies and film have fake teeth in, and they can't speak, and they're doing like a lisp all the time, like they just can't speak through their fake teeth. Well, Charles Dance can speak through his teeth, so his makeup is just very well done. So I liked listening to him and seeing him, and even when he's spouting off exposition, I'm in. I'm listening to him. I understand the curse. I get it. 3 days. Fuck yeah, let's rock and roll. But again, we disappear from him until, which we hinted at earlier, the last scene of the movie, the reshoot. Again, set the stage, modern time. Dracula is now 400 years later in like modern day London or whatever. And across the street, there's Master Vampire, hasn't aged a day. I thought the curse was broken, but guess not. And he gets up and he says the line, "Let the games begin." So hold on. He didn't start the games for 400 years?
Yeah, he had some stuff to do, like who knows how long he cursed. He probably had to go, first of all, I bet he had one hell of a mail backlog, probably had to go get his mail, had to go through all that. Had to catch up. Probably a lot of like books that he hadn't read that he wanted to catch up on. You get busy. Sometimes Chris, I know you get behind, and suddenly you think like, oh my god, I can't believe time passed. Oh my god, 400 years have gone by. Yeah. So now, I had those games. I'm supposed to start the games. Let's go start the games. Yeah.
So stupid.
Yeah, but I agree. I think every scene he's in, you're like, this is kind of the movie I want to be watching, right? This like this kind of over the top, more kind of monstrous theatrical villain. I do think it's weird that in that reshoot, so we alluded to this, that we have this like final scene that establishes Master Vampire is still around. Now he's like kind of following Dracula. I have a little bit more to say about that final scene. We'll get to it in a second, but I did read that they wanted him in that final scene because they thought that Charles Dance's character could be positioned as like the Nick Fury type character. Yeah. In their dark universe, right? This character could pop up in many films. You know what's interesting about that? You know who I think might make a better like character to pop up in all your films? How about fucking Dracula? How about the title character? Why, okay, I like Charles Dance, but why is Master Vampire your big villain here instead of it being Dracula? Again, this goes back to, were they seriously going to make Dracula the giant hero of this franchise and have Master Vampire be this like villain who fights all the monsters? Bullet dodged probably. Yeah. And so, of course, the other final performance we want to talk about is Sarah Gaten. Now, I said I love Sarah Gaten. A somewhat underutilized role here, kind of underwritten. But I think for what the film is asking her to do, like I said, I think it's a testament to both of them. You actually do feel for them as a couple, and I bought into them as a relationship. I did feel like the passion between them. I felt like they came across as a loving couple. I was rooting for them. Again, as a viewer, I don't want to be rooting for them. I don't want this to be the film. But what the film is giving me, she's actually acclimating herself quite well. I did really like her in this.
Same here. I bought it, and it wasn't just surface level sexual tension. They are obviously beautiful people that probably have great sex. It's like, no, I totally can see that these two people love each other. And rarely in a movie like this do you feel that. So it is a testament to their chemistry, but it's not surface level. So I think she does an admirable job in the movie, despite the stumbles along the way.
Also, can we briefly mention her death scene? Because, spoiler alert, she dies. That's a big turning point for Dracula, right? Because again, she's the one who encourages him to, drink her blood and take on the curse. Which again, to me, is just strange because again, it's making even him take on the curse to be not his decision, and also making it a heroic moment, right? Avenging his wife in this way against the evil Turks who murder her. But I also just say the way she dies. This goes back to what we talked about it being bloodless. Chris, she falls off a cliff. I would say falls roughly 3 miles to her death. For some reason, Dracula, who turns into a cloud of bats, cannot catch her. I don't understand that. We've seen him be but it's flying the speed of sound essentially in previous scenes, and now he can't catch his falling wife. But okay, looking past that, falls from a very high cliff. Chris, how would you describe how she looks when he comes upon her body and she has a little bit of life left in her to talk to him?
Well, she doesn't look like a splattered blood of goo, which she should look like.
Nope.
No, she's still living, breathing, and talking, and doesn't even have a scratch on her.
Nope. Perfectly fine. She looks like the gorgeous Sarah Gaden we've seen the entire film. She's like, I fell. It's like, what is it?
Like she tripped in the kitchen.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's just all internal injuries.
Also, by the way, I didn't mean that she's a woman. She's in the kitchen. She's a wife. I just want to throw that out there.
Oh, canceled.
I take that back. Maybe we should. I might cut this out.
All right, Chris. There's kind of just one last thing I want to talk about, and I just alluded to it when I mentioned, him turning into the cloud of bats and flying down, and that is, we said this film very much treats him as a superhero. What did you think of the on-screen visualization of Super Dracula? So let's think of the powers we see him do, right? He can control bats. He can turn into a giant cloud of bats. We see him as super strong, super fast in the battlefield. And a very odd one, he can control clouds. Did you notice that? That's something I thought was weird. You'd think that would be very, very helpful as a vampire, I would just think. But
you'd think when he was so worried about the sun coming out, especially when he was like, everybody go ahead of me, I'll catch up with you in a day. He would just be under the cloud the whole time.
Yeah.
Maybe he needed a couple days to figure it out.
Yeah, so I don't get that one. But here, I will say this, and I'm just curious to hear what you think as well. Every time he turns into bats and kind of becomes this bat cloud, you called it a bat burst earlier. Yeah. You know what? Pretty cool.
No, I like it a lot.
Yeah,
I actually like this. I'm so glad you're with me because it was a little. I didn't remember the trailer when this movie came out, but looking back on it, I remember the feelings on the internet being like, this is strange. But yeah, when he bursts into bats, it's awesome, and it's it's really fast. It's almost like Quicksilvery, like from the X-Men movies. Like he is unstoppable. Which, again, I'm Mr. Movie Rules, but if he's totally unstoppable, then how can he be stopped? But doesn't matter. It's very cool. There's actually the best bat burst of the whole movie is when he turns a bunch of his army people into vampires. So then they go to kill the Turks themselves, right? It's this big massacre. Well, there's this one vampire chick that is super cool looking, and she looks very cliche vampire, very I'm fucked up vampire, right? This one Turk stands up and swings his sword at her, and she bat bursts while the sword goes through her, and then the sword misses her, and she then reformulates into her vampire body, looks at him, smiles, fucking kills the dude, and I was like, more of this, please, more of this.
That scene's awesome, and you're right. She looks so cool, and that scene's badass that, Chris, when I watched that, and I bet you maybe had the same thought. I thought I was watching that and thinking, oh, you know what? At the end of this movie, she's going to become the first bride of Dracula, right? Ooh. We're going to see that loss of humanity and how he's already kind of forgotten about his wife, and he's going to look at that woman, or point her or something and say, you're mine or something, right? And she goes off them. But guess what? Movie doesn't do that because he's a good guy. So, whatever. And speaking to that moment, Chris, because we have to keep hitting this, just one last thing about this. That whole final sequence, okay, so again, I've alluded to this before. The kind of conclusion of this film is he turns his army into vampires, they defeat the Turks, and then we have what is the dramatic climax of this film. And that is that his wife is now dead, he has given into his curse, but he's still ultimately done it for heroic reasons. And then his army tells him, there's only one last thing we have to do, Vlad. We're with you now, we're going to be your vampire army for all eternity, but we have to kill your son. Mm-hmm. Your son, they say, your son, they point to him and they say, all humans, including your son, they're all our enemies now. Here's the problem. In the proper, better version of this film, that would be Dracula's line. Dracula's the one we want to hear kind of turn against humanity. This movie only gives Dracula a reason to hate other vampires, not to hate humans, right? His last action in this is to fight all the other vampires and try to protect his son and essentially protect humanity from the army he's created. So again, I'm just bringing it up to say, what is this? Why is, like, this is Dracula Untold, and instead of showing me a Dracula who shuns humanity because of what it does to him, this is one that says, oh, actually, there's all these other vampires who are really bad, and they want to take out humanity, but he's like, no, guys, let's be good, and if not, I will fucking murder you all, and I will just kill myself. I will sacrifice myself. Weird. Just weird. This is a weird movie.
This is a weird movie, Trev, especially since a movie like this would probably have a great motif. Right, for Dracula, something that you can hum, just like the score from Bram Stoker's Dracula, one of the best scores of all time. Trev, you witnessed that. You told me to listen to it, especially when I was watching it, to really, really hear it, and oh boy, that's a doozy. So I'm going into this movie looking at the list. I mentioned it before, audience. I said they got the guy who did the music to Iron Man. Well, that is Ramin Djawadi. And he has since become kind of a household name for Game of Thrones, Westworld, a bunch of other shit. This guy is...
Those are all great scores, so this one must be great too, huh, Chris?
Oh, you'd think so, Trev. But what we got was actually the notes that fell off the table in his basement while he was like having a party, and threw it all together, because this score is, like I said, blah.
Yeah, it's a very generic score that no motifs, nothing memorable. I mean, even like his Iron Man score, I can still remember and hear in my head today. Great Game of Thrones, Westworld, both full of like great iconic themes. And yeah, I think you're right. This sounds like leftovers from Game of Thrones, maybe, because this has like this a little bit of a Game of Thrones, feel to it. Somebody's just like, oh, I have some stuff from Game of Thrones I didn't use. I just want to use this. Yeah, sure. Let's take that.
Now, is this a good place, Trev? We have a couple of rewrites. So usually, Trev himself has a rewrite for the movies, which I despise, because I hate when people rewrite movies. It drives me crazy, because they're only rewriting the movie because they saw the movie and now they can make changes. So fair enough. Trev usually does this, but fellow listener, something changed in me. I finished the movie and I immediately texted Trev and I said, oh boy, I have a rewrite. Yeah. So I don't know who I am anymore, but I'm gonna let's go with Trev first, and then
it's interesting because we both have different. We both said we have versions of this film existing a little differently in our head. I'm very curious to see what the overlap is here.
Yeah.
Because I was looking at this as saying, if you gave me this script in the pre-production of this film, how much would I change? And I actually, as we talked about before, since I think some of this is kind of interesting, and I just ultimately wanted this to be a little bit more of a Breaking Bad kind of version of the story, I'll actually leave the first kind of 2 acts mostly alone. I think I'll live with this setup, right, of it being Vlad the Impaler was turned into a warrior, got away from that life, is now this like more heroic, likable Transylvania prince. The Turks come, try to take all the children. He takes on this curse. Okay, so now he has 3 days, right? I think the biggest difference to get to what I want, where I want the ending to be, is that he should come so close to getting to the end of this 3 days, right? With everything going right. And actually, before the curse is done, he should defeat the Turks. He leads his army through. And meanwhile, what you were talking about, Chris, how there's that scene about halfway through the film where the men and women just suddenly realize he's a vampire and attack him and then get over it. Forget that scene. Instead, all throughout the film, have them keep getting more and more hints that there's something about him that's evil, right? And we see that suspicion growing. They're getting more kind of concerned about him, but they're going along with it because he is helping them defeat the Turks. He defeats the Turks. They all work together to defeat the Turks, and his wife is still alive. His son is still alive, but now is the point where his people turn on him. In the wake of him defeating the Turks, suddenly his people turn on him, and because they know how powerful he is, what is the way you turn on him? How do you try to hurt him? You go after his family. And his own people turn on him and kidnap his wife and son, and basically are threatening his wife and son. And as Dracula looks on, there's just minutes left in the curse, and they are threatening to kill his wife. And his wife even says to him, right, she looks across to Dracula and she says, no matter what happens, do not give in. You are human. You can beat this curse. Do not give in. Please do not try to avenge me in the way I know you're thinking of, because what will happen to you. And then right in front of his eyes, they murder his wife, right? And in that moment, he decides not to listen to his wife. in his pure pain and his pure horror of what happened, he gives into the curse and he brutally attacks his own people, right? He attacks them. Now, granted, you could still say this is justified, but you see him do it in a way where, wow, he just kind of completely leans in. He has given the curse. He has become the Dracula. And now he has a reason to hate humanity, because humanity, even though he was a hero to them, even though he did this for them, they turned on him. They did not see how he was helping them. And they said, that's fine. We used you for your power, but now we have turned on you and we've murdered your wife. And in this subsequent battle, he's just slaughtering people left and right, taking them down, mowing them down. He's just slashing and biting at everyone he comes across, suddenly turns, slashes. Guess what? I know this is kind of cliched. Oops, he killed his own son. And he looks down and realizes, oh my God, one of the people I killed was my son. Now he stands over it, and now you have a setup of like, wow, this is now this is a Dracula who has turned his back on humanity, hates humanity, also hates himself, though, because he took on this curse. His curse forced him to murder his own son. And as I said, I already alluded to this, but I think it'd be kind of cool if in the final moments, the only three of the vampire, or of his people that are left are like some of the women of the village. And he kind of purposely comes up to them, and like you kind of maybe just see him hovering over them. And then when you flash forward to the future, those same women now are shown to us as the brides of Dracula. And we realize, oh, now we're looking at a Dracula who has kind of lost that humanity. And we just saw the birth of a villain. So that's the rewrite to me. I want the ending of this film to be him given a reason to go against humanity and to become the monster he has talked about throughout the whole film. So that's my rewrite.
That's awesome. First of all, I love it. I really do. Mine's going to be a little less in depth,
Okay.
but that was very. I am very impressed. And I don't say that much because I don't find you impressive. But that was good. That was good. Okay, so at the end of this movie, like we said, his wife, splatters sort of, and then says, "Drink my blood, and then you can become, the vampire forever." Right? Mm-hmm. So he does. And then he turns a bunch of his army members, and then they go fight the Turks, and then his army members turn on him, like we said before, and he actually kills one of his friends, part of the army, and puts him on a spike, right? Mm-hmm. And kills the vampire general, and then saves his kid, and his kid runs off into the sunset, and then, or the sunrise, actually, and him and his whole army dust, sort of, because he doesn't actually dust that well, but it doesn't matter. Yeah. So that's the ending that we saw. Well, my ending changes it a bit. So his wife is falling down, just like we did, right? Falling down from the tower. Vlad is racing to catch her, and still doesn't catch her, but she's on the ground and she is dying. So she says, drink my blood. So he does the same thing, drinks her blood. But Trev, he realizes, hey, I'm just going to feed her my blood. Because if I feed her my blood now, she's going to come back alive as the undead, because he knows the rules. This happened to him already. He knows what to do. He understands the rules of his own movie, unlike the movie that we saw. Okay? So he bites into her. He fucking vamps out, and then he cuts his wrist with his nail, and he just spreads it over her mouth, and she drinks it. She doesn't even know what's happening. She doesn't get it, right? But he's doing, because he's fucking Dracula now, Trev. So he does it. Cut to the Turks. All of a sudden, you see his army of vampires, right? Coming over the horizon. But guess who's leading them? Him and his wife. Now they are vamped out. Now they are ready to take fucking names. So they do the whole sequence of them destroying the Turks, and then you see this sweet wife played by Sarah Gaten. The whole time you've seen her, she was so loving and caring, and I love my family. No violence, please. She's fucking, her humanity, man, is gone. Okay, she is killing everybody, right? And Dracula is obviously joining in, but not to the extent as his wife. Just not to the extent. Kills all the Turks. They stand around. They save the boy. The boy's standing there, right? And they're a family again. But you know who starts to turn on the boy? His wife. His wife, the mother of this child, starts looking at him and is like, Vlad, come on. We're going to eat the boy. Right? We're going to kill the boy. And all of a sudden now, Vlad has a moment of what do I do? Do I kill my own kid, or do I kill my wife? And he then, instead of impaling one of the generals like he does in the movie, He impales his wife that he just saved, that would do everything for her, and she's impaled on the spike, and she dusts in the sunrise. So the son still gets away. We allow that to all happen. He goes with old Renfield. He goes away. He gets there. But Dracula realizes that humanity is meaningless because if his soulmate, everything that he's lived for can turn in a blink of an eye, he realizes humanity is fucking doomed and there's no point. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of maybe right.
Yeah. Well, here, I liked my version, but let me tell you what I liked about yours, Chris. Your version gives me a sexy Sarah Gaden vampire. That's right? That's an additional $200 million in box office right there. So, but yeah, I think both of our rewrites point to what our common problem is with this ending, is that we were both trying to find how does this movie get his soul away from him?
Yep.
Because as we alluded, there's the final scene here that was added in, production for them, and that is a flash forward to the modern day, right? So the end of this movie proper is that he kills his vampire army and sacrifices himself. He allows himself to dust somewhat in the sunlight, but then we see this like Renfield figure come, and now we jump forward to modern day, and it's such a weird transition because it just cuts to like Dracula as a dude walking down the street. What a weird cut, right? Because now here you're putting Dracula in modern day. You're telling me that this is the sequel tease, but I don't know anything about Dracula at this point. Like, what have the past like 400 years been like for him, right? What is this character? Has he continued to be heroic? Has he become the villain? I don't know. And then you just have him bump into Sarah Gaden again. Obviously, they're playing the Bram Stoker's Dracula card here. He sees her, recognizes her as the reincarnation of his wife, starts flirting with her. Oh, guess what she says her name is? Mina.
Yeah.
So she's Mina Murray, right? So we get like, oh, okay. And that's when we see the Master Vampire watching them. But the scene plays so weird because it's just so sudden, and I don't get what it's telling me about this version of Dracula. Am I supposed to be happy that he's found Mina? Am I worried for her? Is he a threat to her? Is he still a superhero? I guess they would have given us the answers to these questions, but I'm not surprised nobody wanted those answers.
And yes, they did not want to answer any of these questions. Nobody cared, so they jettisoned the whole idea of this starting the Dark Universe. They downplayed all the connections, and you know who they looked to? Tom Cruise. Mm-hmm. You know, we talked about this in our Van Helsing episode, but Tom Cruise was maybe going to be Van Helsing at one time. Talk started to come up again, and they said, you know what? Let's reboot The Mummy. The Mummy franchise that initially got us to the success that we are with our Universal Monsters. And that's what we're looking at next episode is 2017's The Mummy, starring Tom Cruise.
Yeah, the second beginning of the Dark Universe.
Yes.
Since this one fell on its undead face.
Yes.
So our Halloween Spectacular will be finally an episode I know a lot of people have been waiting to hear because it's often looked at today as probably the best, most commonly remembered in the moment failure of a giant franchise starter, The Mummy. I'm very, very excited to talk about that.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So follow along at F2F Pod. That's at F2, the number 2F Pod on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all of that stuff. Check your podcast app. Like us there. Like us everywhere. Rate, review, whatever you do. That would be awesome if you shoot us a star rating on any platform that you use. Also, just join the tribe, hit that subscribe, and you'll be witness to the culmination of the curse of the Dark Universe happening next episode. So,
right.
Yeah, it's going to be exciting.
Bust out your fangs as we go out with a bang. I wanted one too, Chris.
I know.
Okay.
Thanks for listening.
I tried.
Yeah.